In this video, we'll continue our study of the microstructures that give shape to the second sublecture. The next microstructure involves a palistrophe in Block 2a. Block 2a, as you'll see on the screen, spans Proverbs 27, beginning with verse 5 and continuing with verse 10. We've entitled it Receiving Reproof, the Importance of Relationships and Receptivity. The sage here employs a 7-part palistrophe to teach the importance of both receptivity and relationships as a context for reproof. The first through the third steps ascend the palistrophe, and these govern chapter 27, verses 5, 6, and 7. The palistrophe then pivots on the fourth step, which is verse 8, and then turns around and descends through steps 3 prime, 2 prime, and 1 prime. These correspond respectively to verses 9, the first 2 parts of verse 10, and the last part of verse 10. The palistrophic correspondence is evident in the following elements. Steps 1 and 1 prime both begin with better statements. Better is reproof, and then better is a near neighbor, when help, including the help consisting of reproof, is wanted. In terms of the verses again, that links verse 5 with 10c. Let's take a moment to read those verses. Verse 5 reads, Better is reproof revealed than love kept secret. 10c, Better is one who dwells nearby than a brother far away. Steps 2 and 2 prime both underscore the necessity of supportive, and they're called loving, time-tested relationships if reproof is to function healthfully. Steps 2 and 2 prime link verses 6 and the first 2 parts of verse 10. Verse 6 reads, To be trusted are wounds from one who loves, but manipulative are kisses from one who hates. And verse 10, parts A and B read, Do not abandon your friend and your father's friend, and do not enter your brother's house when you experience distress. Both of these speak to trusted or faithful relationships as the source for valuable reproof. Steps 3 and 3 prime both accent how vital it is for the recipient of reproof to welcome it with a receptive appetite, as it's called, treating a friend's counsel as desirable as fragrant perfume. This joins verses 7 and 9. Verse 7 reads, A satisfied appetite will trample on a honeycomb, but as for a hungry appetite, anything bitter is sweet. And verse 9, Perfume and incense may delight the mind, but sweetness of its friend issues from advice regarding appetite. The pivot in step 4, which constitutes the palistrophic zenith, is reserved to warn the courtier whose youthful wanderlust would incline him to cast aside those webs of trustworthy relationships that have enjoyed long cultivation by generations past. And that's verse 8. Verse 8 reads, As a bird wandering from its nest, so is a person inclined to wander from his place. So here the sage is teaching, without this trove of wise friends, how can the courtier hope to access the treasure that consists of loving reproof? The next microstructure involves a dual theme and a chiastic conclusion that occurs in Unit 2b2, that is 27, verses 14 through 16. Notice especially verse 16. 2 negative repercussions of failed reproof are presented in verse 16. Those who hide her hide the wind, and oil will accidentally get on his right hand. With the expression, those who hide her, this first hemistich of 16 continues the description of the contentious wife with her incessant reproving. We met her in verse 15, which reads, an incessant dripping on a persistently rainy day, that is what a contentious wife is like. Now back to 16, notice that we have first an imagery of wind in the first hemistich, and then imagery of oil in the second. This shift from irrepressible wind in 16a to oil on the hand in 16b is notifying us that the sage has in mind a different scenario of failed reproof as we move from first half to second half. Like the scenario in 16a, so also the scenario in 16b is negative in its evaluation, negative and uncontained. Furthermore, in 16b, the scenario is messy, oil on one's hand. Since oil in and of itself would comprise a beneficial product, designating food, fuel, or costly perfume, this second hemistich likely recalls the well-intentioned but untimely message of beneficial blessing that we saw in verse 14. 14 reads, "One who blesses his neighbor with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, a curse will be reckoned to him." Thus, even a message of affirmation, a blessing, will, according to 16b, soil the messenger's hand if its delivery is poorly timed. So in this way, 16a, with its reference to hiding a woman, restraining a woman, corresponds to the contentious wife of verse 15, and the reference to oil accidentally getting on his right hand, notice that's masculine, his hand in 16b, corresponds to verse 14, where we have a masculine individual who is issuing an untimely blessing, and we find that a curse is rendered to him, masculine. This is what we mean by saying that verse 16 is dual theme in its conclusion nature, and it is also chiastic, for it reverses the order of the man and the woman encountered in 14 and 15. The last microstructure of section 2 involves closure. That takes place in 27:18. It reads, "One who guards a fig tree will eat its fruit, and one who guards his master will be given glory." So we see that section 2 closes with the picture of a courtier who is supportive of his master and who thereby attains glory. Notice that it is the last word in verse 18. As noted earlier in connection with macrostructures, this attainment of glory figures prominently in this sublecture. We can see it in 25:28, 26:1, and 26:8. And in fact, it has loomed large as the summum bonum since the start of the entire master lecture. Think back to 25:2. It connects thereby with the theme of magnificence in a monarchy. Now, as far as section 2 is concerned, verse 18 is the only place where the word glory occurs. However, semantically, it links to the first word of this section, supplying a degree of dimension to qualify that first word. That first word in Hebrew is good. It's rendered better in this saying of 27:5, the opening verse of this section. Better is reproof revealed than love kept secret. Now, not until the last word of the section, glory, does the pupil discover how much better this reproof actually is. In fact, it possesses such high value that one may attain even glory thereby. By connecting reproof with this level of goodness, the sage states clearly that reproof is mission critical for anyone intent on reaching magnificence. We come now to microstructural features that operate within section 3, that is chapter 27, verses 19 through 22. There are two of these. The first involves double terms that appear in a single verse. Given the verbal frugality that is inherent to apophthegms, for a single saying to employ the same word twice is rare. Yet the two initial verses here in section 3 do this very thing, with a pair of instances occurring in the first verse. Face appears twice in verse 19, as does the word mortal. Let's read that. Just as water reveals the face to that face, so the motives of a mortal reveal to that mortal. The next verse presents the expression be satisfied twice. Verse 20, Sheol and the underworld will not be satisfied, and the eyes of a mortal will not be satisfied. Although not repeating identical words, the last verse of this section, verse 22, is noteworthy since it repeats two pairs that trace to common roots. So, the word pulverize and the word mortar both trace to the Hebrew root katash. And the word for fool and folly, not surprisingly, both trace to a single root, aval. Earlier, the sage employed this device of double words in a single verse at structurally strategic points. So in 25:2, we find the word glory appearing twice at the outset of the entire master lecture. And again, glory appears twice toward the close of block 2a. That's in verse 27 of chapter 25. In 27:7, the word appetite appears twice, and this establishes a palistrophic link with its corresponding limb in 27:9. So, for two independent words to appear doubly here in 27:19, face appears twice and mortal appears twice. This helps to draw attention to the opening line of this sublecture's last section. And when in verse 20, satisfaction appears twice, it underscores a dynamic that strikes at the heart of this sublecture's teaching, namely the dynamic or the principle concerning the contest between greed and generosity. Satisfaction, repeated twice in 20, speaks to the entire struggle between greed and generosity. Finally, it's fitting for the sage to employ doubling in the last verse, that is verse 22, in order to call attention to that verse, since that is the verse that brings this entire sublecture to a close, a sublecture that began in 25:13. The second and final microstructure in this third section involves dynamic progression concerning the theme of motives. Each of the verses here in section 3, again that's chapter 27, verses 19 to 22, each of these verses contributes to a dynamic progression surrounding the theme of inner motivation. Section 3 begins with a preface in verse 19. This is an apothegm that speaks to the importance of becoming fully aware of one's own motives. Let's read that. Just as water reveals the face to that face, so the motives of a mortal reveal to that mortal. Motives are what it is that brings a mirror before a person, as it were, helping them to truly see themselves. After verse 19, the remaining three verses explore alternative motives that may come to light under such self-examination that's described in verse 19. Given the association of the word face with peer reproof, which took place just 2 verses earlier, you see that in 17, may iron by iron grow sharp, and may a person sharpen the face of his friend. So given the association of face with peer reproof there in 17, now in 19 to showcase revealing the face to that face, showcasing that in the process of gaining self-awareness, carries this implication. Peer reproof, such as in verse 17, can aid in the process of self-examination. Next then, after 19, there follows a review of 3 truths that speak to motives, especially as regards greed and generosity, themes that we've seen earlier in this sublecture. First, consider verse 20. It reads, Sheol and the underworld will not be satisfied, and the eyes of a mortal will not be satisfied. So, if one's life is driven by addiction to greed, never being satisfied, there will, the sage says, be no end of want, no attainment of satisfaction. Comparing to Sheol accents the ultimate failure of this error. And the warning against enslavement to greed recalls the broad teachings that spanned across Block 1A, starting in 25:13, going through the end of that chapter. So greed was a major theme back there, and now we see it resurfacing in this conclusion, this third recap. Second, and now we're moving to verse 21. Second, the sage counters greed with his most prized antidote, namely a profoundly refined generosity that selflessly issues honor to others. Notice verse 21. A smelting pot corresponds to silver, and a small smelting furnace corresponds to gold, and an individual corresponds to his praising mouth. The fact that this process involves praise which is issued by this person, his mouth, as opposed to praise that he's receiving from others, this fact follows from the expression, his praising mouth. He is the agent of this praise. He is the source of it. Whether it would be greedily exalting himself, praising himself, that incidentally was specifically discouraged back in 25:6 in the first sublecture. It was also discouraged in chapter 27, verses 1 and 2, part of this sublecture. So either he's going to be using his mouth greedily to praise himself, or he will generously use his mouth to exalt or praise someone else. This should remind us of the concept of promoting someone else's glory. Perhaps you recall encountering that in 25:27, a key and pivotal verse. And that whole concept of seeking the well-being of someone else, this is modeled by the faithful employee that we found in 25:13 and again in 25:25. So the sage is asserting the following principle. The discipline of sincerely praising others constitutes a character refining crucible, just as a smelting pot corresponds to silver, a small smelting furnace corresponds to gold, an individual corresponds to his praising mouth. That is, if an individual can exhibit the self-control and respect of others, and frankly humility, to look beyond himself and praise others when they're worthy of that, be generous in this way, then that is like taking his character and refining it to pure gold. Such generosity of spirit, the sage is teaching, truly achieves magnificence, a refined, pure quality. Now, since it's true that not all appeals to the courtier to please be generous to me, not all appeals to generosity are equally deserving, the sage proceeds in verse 22 to remind the courtier of this very fact, and this is the closing verse of this sublecture. This he achieves by reintroducing the figure of the fool. Notice verse 22. If you were to pulverize a fool in a mortar with a pestle, together with hulled barley, his folly would not leave him. Mention of the fool in an earlier recap, thinking here of 27 verse 3, when the sage mentioned the fool in that recap, it served to recall not specifically the fool, but a broader section and character, the stupid fellow. The stupid fellow, you may recall, had in essence kind of a subtitle of being the fool. He showed up with expansive treatment in 26, 1 through 12, the first of the three characters who may, in a misguided fashion, appeal to the courtier's generosity And for those kind of appeals, the sage issued caution. So as we encounter the fool now in 27:22, it should remind us that he showed up in an earlier recap with caution, labeled fool, and that in turn stitched back to the 12-verse section on the stupid person, who has in essence a code name, a subtitle of the fool. In this way, here in the last verse of this entire sublecture, the sage reminds the courtier to be on guard lest a superficially legitimate request for advocacy and honor turn out to be unfounded, consequently bringing shame on the courtier in the process. By stressing how case-hardened the fool is against even the most confrontational attempts at reproof, in a mortar with a pestle, by this the sage fortifies the youth, lest incessant overtures may wear down his wise resistance. Let's sum this up. The dynamic progression, here in section 3, moves along a vector beginning with the importance of gaining self-awareness concerning motives. That's verse 19. The sage says, you need to look inside and figure out what makes you tick, what motivates you. Next, the sage balances the hazard of greed, like Sheol, that is never satisfied, the hazard of greed, that's verse 20, with the antidote of generosity, verse 21. That generosity we recognize as an individual who gives away honor and praise to others to whom it's due, instead of seeking just greedily to praise himself. Lest the courtier apply generosity that was just encouraged in verse 21, lest the courtier apply that generosity indiscriminately, the sage reasonably closes in verse 22 by reminding that appeals for generosity from certain characters, like fools, should routinely be denied, because those fools consistently refuse reproof. You can pound them in a mortar with a pestle. They will not absorb the reproof. Effort should not be wasted trying to do for such individuals what they refuse to do for themselves. This closes our study of the various structures that give shape to this second sublecture. In the next video, we'll conclude our study of this second sublecture by exploring the lessons that we can extract from it for daily living.